For those of you who I haven't met yet, my name is Patty Pon, P-O-N. I have the great honor and privilege of being the CEO, President and CEO for Calgary Arts Development. And it's just been a really honor for us to be able to host these town halls. It's just been an extraordinary learning journey for me personally. And it's been really wonderful to see so many of you with us from our communities joining us for these town halls. So we're going to get started today. We're really excited to have some very special guests with us who will be doing a presentation around anti-racism and really are very appreciative of them sharing their knowledge and their experience with us today. So as is our practice, before we get started, we have some protocols and some general practices that we always start off with. And today I'd invite my teammate, Sarah Bateman, to take us through those protocols. So over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Patty, and thank you everybody for joining us today. So I'm just going to go over some of the technical and protocols for our time together. Mark is running this event for us today, so if you have any technical issues or questions, please privately chat with him. And just want to say thank you, Mark, for all your help this summer on the town halls. We also have two ASL interpreters with us today, Kimberly and Janice. In order to ensure that both interpreters and speakers are actively visible throughout the event, I would ask you that if you're not speaking, please turn your cameras off. You can click on the top menu of your video and select Hide Non-Video Participants, and this will ensure that the speakers and the translators remain visible, either in a grid or speaker view. Janice and Kimberly will turn their cameras on and off as they switch. You can still pin a video to your main screen through the same menu. There will be a presentation shared at one point today, so you can use the menu on the top right to switch the presentation and the speaker screens and pin the interpreter as needed. We are also using a transcription app called Otter AI. You can click the red box at the top of the screen if you'd like to use it. Unfortunately, it is only in English for the time being and is not quite 100% accurate, but can be used to follow along today's conversations. We are recording this meeting for future reference and to be able to share it with those folks that can't make it for this time. If you are using private chat, please be aware that when we download the recording, we might be able to see all chat, including the private chat. So just keep that in mind. We will not share the private chats in any recordings we upload to our website. And we will release the recording. When we do release the recording, we will include an accurate transcript. If you have joined us before, you'll know that Calgary Arts Development uses group agreements to set shared expectations and a commitment to safety and bravery in the spaces we occupy together. Those agreements can be found in the instructions document that has just been posted in the chat. At our last town hall, the CommunityWise Anti-Racism Organizational Change Working Group also shared with us their accountable spaces guidelines, and today we'd like to focus on those. You can find those guidelines also in the instructions document, and we will share the direct link to them. I'm hoping this is the right one. Let me know if that doesn't work. So some of the highlights, we're sharing the space. Please be mindful of your speaking time, make space for others to speak, and avoid interrupting others. Please keep your mics on mute when you're not speaking, but feel free to share a reaction in the chat. If the moderator is open to questions, at that time, please raise your hand in the chat. Understand that individuals experience racism in different ways. Recognize that each experience and viewpoint is valid, even if they differ. Validate experiences rather than lecturing or giving advice. Consider that you do not need to agree with a perspective in order to understand it. Speak for yourself. Use I language. Don't speak for others and don't share someone else's stories or experiences. Notice your own biases and judgments and avoid making assumptions about other people. Examine your own privilege and be aware of the potential power dynamics that you might contribute to within a space. Also recognize that we are all in a place of learning. If you say something problematic, apologize, listen to the voices of others, and then learn and adjust your behavior. Be open to calling in harmful attitudes as well as open to critical self-reflection. If an individual tells you that something you said was harmful to them, listen. Use these situations not to harass or call out, but as a learning experience. And finally, take care of yourself. Think of someone you trust whom you can debrief with and plan to contact them. It's okay if you need to leave the room at any time, and the facilitators are available for follow-up conversations. In addition to these accountable spaces guidelines, I want to also state that we recognize that asking people to share in this space is a request that requires emotional labor and vulnerability. Calgary Arts Development commits to the promise that there will be no retribution against people for the stories and perspectives they share, and we ask that all participants commit to that same thing. Any participant who uses harmful or disrespectful language or who are actively disregarding the group agreements will be asked to leave the town hall. If they choose not to leave, they will be removed. Please privately chat with my colleague Sherry, who will be supporting today's town hall as an active bystander. If you feel uncomfortable or unsafe, or see that a participant is using harmful or offensive language, Sherry's your person to get in touch with. Sherry, can you introduce yourself right now so people can find your screen?
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Sherry. As Sarah stated, if you have any questions or issues during the meeting, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm just going to share a little bit of information here about what a bystander is and the bystander effect. Essentially, if you feel uncomfortable or safe or see that a participant is using harmful or offensive language, please do let us know. I'll be watching the chat as well. The term bystander effect refers to the phenomenon in which the greater the number of people that are present, the less likely people are to help a person in distress. And there's a number of reasons why this can occur, but one of the key observations is that the behavior of others often strengthens the bystander effect if they remain passive. However, if others exhibit active reactions, the bystander effect may be reduced. And therefore, an individual is more likely to help someone if someone else has initiated action. So the active bystander is the person who witnesses an emergency or a power-based violence. They recognize it as such and they take it upon themselves to do something about it. There's specific methods that can be utilized to help de-escalate a situation and reduce harm. And as bystanders, we need to be especially vigilant and aware of what disrespect, harassment, racism, and hate violence look like in order to be able to stand up and intervene when people need it the most. So please chat privately with me if you feel uncomfortable or unsafe. If you feel that anyone that's on the call today is not upholding the group agreements or the accountable spaces guidelines are not being respected. And part of my role today as the active bystander is to help ensure that we're collectively adhering to these group agreements. As it has been mentioned, participants who break those agreements will be contacted directly by me, and if necessary, they will be removed from the discussion. So that is the role of the active bystander, and I look forward to hearing everything that's going on today. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Sherry. We will be opening the floor for questions after our invited guests share their thoughts with us, and we hope to hear from as many of you as possible today. If you would like to speak, please open the participants list at the bottom of your screen. At the bottom of the list, you'll see raise hand. You can also indicate that you would like to share within the chat. When you speak, please state your name clearly and pause before speaking so people have time to find your screen. If your Zoom username is different than the name you'll introduce yourself by, please use the menu function to update your name so it's easier to find you. You can use the three-dot menu on your screen to update your name and share your pronouns if you wish. My colleague Leslie will be collecting questions from the chat box and watching for raised hands. We'll try to get to as many people in questions as possible in this short time. And again, if you have any questions or challenges with technology or accessibility, please privately chat with Mark. And I'm just going to turn it over to my colleague, Sable, if she's on the line, for a land acknowledgement. Sable.
Hi.
Hi, Sable. Over to you. Thanks for being here.
Okay, everyone. Welcome to the town hall today. I want to acknowledge that we are here, most of us are here on the the land of Treaty 7 here in southern Alberta. This is the territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani, as well as the Tsuut'ina Nation and the Stoney Nakoda people. That's Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Wesley, which are west of Calgary. And I just wanted to mention that we're coming up to the 143rd anniversary of the signing of Treaty 7 this September. And we were originally going to be having a showcase of Indigenous artists who applied to CADA's 2019 Original Peoples Investment Program. But unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we had to cancel that showcase. But we are actually going to be featuring the profiles of 5 different artists, Indigenous artists, on the week of September 22nd. And I was really lucky yesterday to go out to Tsuut'ina Nation to interview 2 amazing artists, a mother and son by the name of Glenna Cardinal and her son Seth Cardinal Dodging Horse. Seth is a filmmaker and graduated from I still have them in my mind as ACAD, Alberta University of the Arts, is what they changed their name to. And he recently graduated, I think it was last year. And his mother, Glenna, has had a show exhibition in with the Esker Foundation, and I think Truck Gallery as well. And so yeah, I got to spend some time out in Tsuut'ina with them yesterday. It was beautiful, beautiful day. And the people that were the crew that was filming the interview were the Stoney Nakoda Audio Visual Club. So we had me, a Blackfoot, the Stoney Nakoda Audio Visual Club, and Seth and Glenna from Tsuut'ina Nation. And it just felt really good to have this collaboration of Treaty 7 First Nation people coming together. It doesn't happen too often these days because of the pandemic, but it felt really good to be out there on the land with them. And I really look forward to this coming September when we can show everyone the work that these amazing artists have done in 2019, and looking forward to 2021 when hopefully we can have an actual showcase of the Indigenous artists' work. So thank you, and I also want to acknowledge that we also have the other many First Nations and Métis people that also share this land here in Calgary, Mohkinstsis. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sable. And thanks to Sarah and Sherry for walking us through some of our technical considerations as well as our practices. Again, if you open up the participants list, you'll see that many of us from Calgary Arts Development have preceded our name with CADA. So if there are any other particular questions that you might have, you can sort of scoot up to the top of the participants list, and a good number of us are listed there. Sable it's always a real treat to hear Sable give the land acknowledgement, because she also includes a learning, whether in this case it's about the OPIP showcase and some of the extraordinary artists that she's had the opportunity to meet and work with and interview, or reminders of the signing of Treaty 7 and the anniversary. This past weekend, I had the great gift of attending a performance outside. It was just an extraordinary restorative time. Like since March, I think that was the first it was the first arts event I'd been able to attend in person. And it just reminded me of how much I miss everybody. And also getting to be outside on the land and seeing the work of these artists, experiencing that work outside, really reminded me of everything that Sable has taught me over the many times I've had a chance to hear from her and listen and learn from her about the relationship that the original people of this place have to their ancestral home, and then subsequently the relationships that all of us bring to that space outside as well. It was an extraordinarily restorative time. And so again, many thanks, Sable, for reminding me of that today. So as I said earlier, we have two really special guests with us. Today, they are advisory group members from the Anti-Racist Organizational Change. Some of you may know the acronym AROC and perhaps have taken part in some of the online resources and tools that they have available. This is the AROC project is available through CommunityWise Resource Centre. Tyson Bankert, also a member of the Black Caucus, and jaqs, gallos, aquines will talk about the distinction of allyship versus accompliceship. For some of you who were with us at our last town hall a couple of weeks ago, we started to touch on that a bit, and community care. The Black Caucus is a group out of the CommunityWise Resource Centre that provides a space for Black anti-racism organizers and facilitators to work together, develop resources, and host trainings on addressing anti-Black racism. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Tyson and jaqs. Tyson Bankert is a community developer and facilitation nerd who has found a niche at the junction of building the capacity for community and justice. His personal slogan is edify others, befriend the lonely, and promote justice. jaqs, gallos, aquines is an anti-racism facilitator and community organizer who has recently designed an anti-racism forum for the Filipinx diaspora in Canada through Bahagari, a grassroots org they co-founded. Much of their work, including their podcast, book to be published by ANAC Winnipeg next month, and writing projects are centered on race, culture, identity, and diaspora in pursuit of justice, liberation, and joy. So I'd now like to hand it over to Tyson and jaqs. Welcome and thank you for being with us today.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining up. I'm going to be sharing my screen today. So there'll be a presentation that will last roughly about an hour and maybe 20 minutes. So, but jaqs and I do aim to try and make it as interactive as possible with some things that I think will help to encourage and inspire us to continue to do some of this anti-racism work. So I'm going to share my screen here. And I also just really want to thank Patty and the rest of CADA for allowing for this conversation to continue to keep happening on a regular basis. I think it's incredibly important. And Sarah and Sherry as well, those grounding agreements are really important to ensuring that anti-racism work and sometimes the discomfort that folks might feel in this space to really guide us through this. So I really appreciate both of your points when it comes to creating a safe space to have this conversation as well. So I just want to make sure everyone can see this as I figure out how to increase it as well. Jax, is there anything that you would like to say before we get started?
Yeah, I just also wanted to thank Sable for the land acknowledgement and Sarah and Patty for introducing us as well. And I do want to just give an acknowledgement for ourselves as well, as we are new to the space together. I just wanted to just say that I guess like the land acknowledgement isn't like an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and a way of honoring the First Nations people who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. It is important to understand the long-standing history that has brought us to reside here on the land and to seek to understand our place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in the past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. Acknowledging the land is Indigenous protocol. The Blackfoot, Dene, and Stoney people have been here long before Alberta and Canada were established. The languages, cultures, traditions, civil laws of the First Nations, Métis, and Indigenous precede colonization. Their history and this land predates 150 years. So with that, we'd like to recognize the Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, Tsuut'ina, and Stoney Nakoda nations, which include the Wesley, Bearspaw, and Chiniki, as well as the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. And that was provided by Evans Yell, old woman from Siksika. Thanks.
Sorry, everyone. It is decided to be a little bit slow with the Google Drive here on uploading, so I can show you the full screen in its entirety. Jax, if you wouldn't mind, if you want to...
Want me to share? Sure, no problem. I'll share mine.
And then I'll be able to hopefully get this slide up here for everybody.
Do you want me to just share mine?
Sure, if that works. If yours tends to work. Mine did work 5 minutes ago, so I'm not sure why it's slowing down here.
Okay. Are you looking at my notes? Or are you looking at this?
We are looking at your notes too. So.
Okay, great. I will switch that really quickly. There.
But your notes are great though, so it's great.
Thanks. Okay, we'll pros. Okay.
Okay, everyone. Thanks for giving us a couple minutes there to get ourselves settled. So for today, we will be talking about anti-racism and specifically anti-racism as it relates to organizational change. And so we'll talk a little bit more about how organizations can change with the framework of being anti-racist. And so how anti-R practice and frameworks can create a more equitable organization. And we'll really talk about why that's important. And I think in some of the work that I've been able to see from what Keda has been doing around creating more equitable relationships within public art scene. I think also what's really important is this sense of community care that is really required when we do anti-AR work, because it really allows to ensure that the relationships and the potential harm that can be caused from people feeling, from I think even what Sarah had said around the guiding points, it can be a very traumatic sometimes, but also very healing space to talk about racism, to talk about the impacts of race, but really talking about the value of community care. And then also about a shared language. This shared language that I'm referring to is descriptions and words that we might hear, like, for example, BIPOC, racialized. And so for everyone to be able to hear and listen what those words actually mean, so we're on the same page, I think is very important when we begin anti-AR work, as to what words we use and why we use them. And I also want to acknowledge the fact that within anti-AR work, or through anti-racism work, there's a lot of spectrum of knowledge. So there's folks who have been doing some of this work for a very long time, especially within the art scene as well. And there's folks who are just starting to learn. And so I want to acknowledge that some of the shared language might be actually something that you use in your everyday conversation, but we still want to make sure that part of anti-AR is being able to bring new folks into this work. So if you wouldn't mind, we'll just switch the next slide there.
Yes, so this is we are part of the anti-racist organizational change project through CommunityWise. CommunityWise was a building that was built in 1911 and was started out as the YWCA facility. In 2012, it became CommunityWise after much petitioning by the groups to save the building. And now, for the past 4 years, CommunityWise has been undergoing organizational change to introduce and implement the anti-racist framework that was developed with the group that Tyson and I were both part of. It was first a larger working group, and then also the advisory group comprised of BIPOC folks doing work in the city. So if you're, and then that is an ongoing process that they're still undergoing. And if you're interested in adopting or developing an anti-racist organizational change framework for your organization, please contact AROC. Thanks, Teak. Bella C. Lettner is the equity coordinator over at CommunityWise. And this is the organizational change onion that you would examine every layer through with the work that we would do. So I don't know if you can read that. This onion is a bit hard to read sometimes, but from the outside in, it's external communications, programs, and work with communities, built environment. And then in the next layer inside is human resources, and then hiring, recruitment, and selection, and then finance and fund development, and then monitoring, evaluation, and accountability. And the next layer is governance. And then the inside is theory of change and strategy, as well as vision, mission, and purpose. And the identity and culture and values are determined by, of course, how leadership plays out the values within the organization itself. And we'll be getting a little deeper into that later on.
Thanks, Jax, for that. Yeah, I have a tiny little dog that likes to talk once in a while about anti-racism. So, but she will hopefully settle down a little bit here. I also want to just talk about a note of discomfort here. So the key to moving forward is what we do with our discomfort. We can use it as a door out, blame the messenger, and just disregard the message. Or we can use it as a door in by asking, why does this unsettle me? What could it mean for me if this were true? I think what's important about this is, as I mentioned prior, when we look at that onion and look at all the various components to an organization, we start to really identify that it's going to ask for us to be uncomfortable, to make some changes if that's something that you as an organization want to proceed on. And I think the value of that is, why does it unsettle me? Why is this change is asking me to rethink how I've been doing something. Maybe it's my program I've been running for several years. Maybe it's the way that we think about fund development, or even our mission statement as an organization. So hold on to that discomfort as we go through this, and if you are someone who journals, maybe write some of that work down as things come up as we go through this. All right, so organizational change is about reviewing and modifying management structures and procedures. For example, making changes to policy, hiring practices, and governance. So that is the typical change when we refer to organizational change. And the work that I've been involved in at CommunityWise was looking at CommunityWise, saying we know something needs to change, and we want to do it equitably. So we have to rethink about it through an anti-racist lens, which is where anti-racist organizational change comes into play. So organizational or anti-racist organizational change is about making those changes in a way that intentionally addresses organizational racism and creates greater diversity, inclusion, and equity. And I think what's important when we talk about racism is there's this grounding assumption that we use when we facilitate with groups, is that it is like a fog, honestly, that racism is something that exists around us in that it does impede on a lot of the same fabrics that are within an organization when it comes to the onion, but also in our interpersonal lives and our systems in and out of the public art scene. So this grounding assumption is, sometimes it is so thick, it is visible. Other times it is less apparent, but always, day in, day out, we are breathing it in. Dr. Beverly Tottenham, who has some really great content as well. Just one thing about that discomfort that I wanna refer back to is we're going to be bringing up some terms, like I mentioned, about shared language. And one of the things that we do as a facilitator, that I do when I go into a specific organization, is we do a thing called racial caucusing, which is basically asking folks of color, racialized folk, and also those who are white passing, and we'll talk about those terms as well. And then we also will separate folks who identify as white in the group. And this actually allows for some deeper conversations around anti-racism and its impacts. However, there's about 81 people on this call, and it's Zoom, so we won't be doing that. But one of the ways that I want to encourage an example of this sort of discomfort that happens from that is by actually asking those in our chat here to be brave, take a bit of a risk, and help us with some of our definitions that we're bringing up. So as we go through, there'll be select different definitions, and if you feel comfortable to do so, to describe said definitions for us. I think it would be really important to just sort of help to peel back some of the layers of not just the layers and barriers that we put up when it comes to organizational change. So that's something that, as an activity, that we'll be doing throughout this process. And so please, if that is something that you feel like you need to do or would like to do, by all means, we are very open to that. We will move on ahead. And Jack will talk about the emergent process.
So with the anti-racist framework, it is not something that is a fixed strategy. It is evolving as we move forward. So an emergent process is a process of change that involves nonlinear, abrupt phase transitions as a system's overall structure and function is transformed into a new regime of behavior exhibiting new properties that could not have been predicted to arise prior to the transformation. In other words, change transforms an entire organization into something new and different. Because the organization is complex and changes so deeply, it's difficult to predict exactly what changes will take place. If many of you have already heard about us speak about Adrienne Marie Brown's emergent strategy, this is very much the basis of emergent process. I highly recommend, we all recommend checking it out, reading it, to guide you in the process of your anti-racist framework, as well as your community building, because this is an evolving process that we have to be very sensitive to, dynamically responding to the needs of community, as opposed to just sticking to a strategy from the beginning to the end of your 2-year or 5-year plan. So this is a description of, I guess, a visual of how it would look like. You have your intended strategy, and then you have unrealized strategy. Oops, sorry. And then deliberate strategy and realized strategy. So the emergent strategy at the bottom there, as you can see, is something that will come up as you're moving along the work that you're doing, and just you will incorporate it into like your policies, your governance, new ways of, I guess, reacting to different situations that may arise as you move forward.
So this is an opportunity for folks who would like to talk a little bit, speak about what they understand of these definitions are, and like I said, there isn't necessarily we're open to ensuring that we're creating a space where people can come to learning and calling, and this component of ensuring that folks whether you're really well versed in sort of what these terms are or not, we do want to ensure that people are kind of on the same language as well. So anyone who would like to take a knack at racialized, and this could be for someone who identifies as racialized or white. Also, you do not have to have your video on either.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure, yeah.
Maybe you want to read out what's in the chat?
Yeah, so I see that. So Patty had said, it is someone who identifies as a person of color. Yeah, I think that is part of it. Yeah, for sure. And if you're going to Google, that's also fine as well. I'll give it a few more moments, and then we'll work our way down.
It's Patty here. I wasn't quick enough to think about going to Google. I just typed something that came out at the top of my head.
I appreciate that, Patty. Actually, it's great. I appreciate it. Thank you for leading in this.
And also, Tyson and Jax, I wonder, is it all right if people have questions during your presentation that we invite folks to just type in the chat, and then you can either answer as you go along, or at least we'll have a record of them for the end of the presentation. I suspect another question that people might have is, can they have a copy of the slides? at the end of this. We are recording this event so that for those who cannot stay for the whole presentation, you'll certainly be able to go back to the CADA website and find it.
For sure, we definitely invite questions as we're working through some of them that might be answered. But by all means, of course, feel free to we invite with your questions as well. And so if you, Jackie, if you wouldn't mind putting into the next slide here, what is racialized? I'll kind of begin. Yeah, great. The process by which societies construct races as real, different, and unequal in ways that matter to economical, political, and social life. I think for me personally, this is a term that I use as a Black man to identify with, because I think oftentimes it really, I think, clarifies to me the social construct of what it is to be racial, to be of a person of race, because it oftentimes for me it speaks to the fact that in our world we live in this framework, and so we actually have to and it's not always it's been put on us as people of color, versus it's something that being a non-racialized person, being white, hasn't had the same connotation and as it relates to the economical, political, and social life of just who you are. So for example, right now, when we talk about Black Lives Matter, whether or not I'm someone who agrees with the cause, which I most definitely do, my body as a Black person is still very politicized. And so it's racialized within that lens. Would anyone like to do Indigenous? And by all means, if you have questions about that, we will be able to answer some of that as we go through.
That's a great definition. Thank you, Cesar. Being imbued by characteristics based on race, the color of one's skin.
Yeah. And this is what that's like to thank you. Thanks, Joanne. Yeah. Yeah, and 100%. And I think Indigenous means after colonization can mean very many different things, but that root of depending on the historical context of that. And I think in Canada, of course we have had a system of oppression when it comes to those who came here before us as settlers, through residential schools and 60 Scoop, and the various other myriad ways that that colonization has set up for Canada to oppress Indigenous folks here in Canada. And anyone else that would like to add to that? Because there's a nuance to all of these definitions. Great. Hey, Jack, do you want to click that button there?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, so the term Indigenous includes those that identify as First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. The term also acknowledges the international legal rights under the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which includes status and non-status Indigenous folks as well. All right, and so I mentioned white passing. So when we talk about the caucus, and something that came up when we were initially, a few years ago, when we started the practice at CommunityWise, was the definition of thank you, yeah, that's, yeah, what does it mean to be a person, a white passing person, individual, when it came to, should they go into our white caucus that we were holding, our racialized Indigenous caucus as well. And so that was something where we're like, oh, that's that emergent process that's happening as we're going through and going, where does this person feel like they belong emotionally, but also what sort of privileges have they had in both? So I'm just wondering if anyone would like to add to that, to what white passing means. Yeah, to a point. Yeah, that's usually the outcome. Yeah. Yeah, I think an example of this for me is white passing. I have family members who are seen as white, and so with that comes certain privileges, comes a certain level of having to code, and not being seen as racialized, even though they actually are in certain ways as well. So that would be the one of the ways to define white passing.
Not really. The term model minority is reference to certain immigration policies that have selected highly credentialed immigrants to come to immigrate to North America with high level of education, and they are often determined as the model minority because it's this idea of that this demographic works really hard, and instead of and it's supposed to pit minorities or racialized people against each other, instead of understanding that it's the way that immigration policies determined how people were set up when they got here. Of course, immigration policies have changed as well, where people have been decredentialed from their education levels and had to start over again in many cases. Pam says white passing is very much attributed to assumptions made on physical attributes based on color of skin.
Right. So what do we got here?
That's pretty short and sweet definition. But yes.
I don't know, Jax, if it actually clicked through the definition of white passing.
Oh, I was looking at that one.
Thank you. Yeah, folks who are coded and perceived as white. All right, we got two more, and then we'll continue on with getting more uncomfortable. All right.
Oh, goodness. There we go.
Great. BIPOC. And really just the acronym, honestly, for those of you who are interested in. Thanks, Pam. Yeah, I'll be honest with you, it seems like that's an easy one, and it might be for some folks, but it's actually a term that's been used for a long time, but only in the last, honestly, 10 months have I been seeing it in the media. And I think I want to add to that as well that the way that I understand it is also within the lens of justice. So it's very much centered around the unjust system as it relates to BIPOC. And so, yeah, just to sort of, I think I've heard it referred to just people just casually, but I think we need to kind of talk about it also within the lens of justice. But yes, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And the reason why Black and Indigenous are outside of that is because of the injustices that are explicitly being done to Black and Indigenous. And then anti-Black as our last one here. I think it was talked about at the last session as well, but yeah, great. Yeah, it was talked about last week, and I think that, yeah, exactly. I think it's the you know, I say the hatred of Black the color Black and who and what that represents for folks. I think it is something that Blackness as a is of course a construct, but also it's something that is in every community and culture. And when it comes to those who are darker, tend to have more oppression against them. And we can see this in even other communities when it comes to, you know, light skin versus dark skin, skin whitening. This idea that being too dark or dark is bad, and so and then the systems that are created to ensure that happens. Yeah, and both. Yeah. Go ahead, Jax.
Yeah, I'm just going to speak from like the Filipinx context is that we have a very deeply seated anti-Black sentiment towards our own people of within the Filipino diaspora, because like it's always said when you're growing up, don't ever go out into the sun. And skin whitening products are a very booming industry in the Philippines. You can't buy bar soap there without skin whitening products, unless it's Dove or Ivory.
Great. Thank you for the beliefs, I've been prejudiced towards people of Black African descent. Thank you. All right, we will go into sort of, and I appreciate everyone for taking the time to do this, because I think what really is important is that it's a learning curve. It's something that folks that we're not used to understanding and learning about. Sometimes we understand the headlines of what we read. There's actually these terms are very even nuanced in the definitions of how one might understand them and experience them as well. And so I think it's just really important to begin to sort of build that shared language as we move forward. So I'll kind of chat for the next little 10 minutes here about what is and what isn't anti-racism. And then we'll then head into the onion and talk a few components of that onion as it relates to creating a more anti-racist organization. And then we will talk about community of care. All right, so equity. Equity is integral part to anti-racism. I've listened to lots of the various town halls, and it really became apparent to me the importance of equity as it relates to CADA and their and what that looks like moving forward. And so I encourage those folks who think, yeah, I want to begin establishing equity. I want to begin to understand what it looks like. And I get it. And lately, over the course of the summer, folks within the Black Caucus and at AROC have been interested, are getting a lot of phone calls from folks who are like, yeah, I want to learn about anti-Blackness, and I want to learn about historical oppression and colonization. But then we have some folks who just want to learn about equity. And although that's a great something great to strive for, as I mentioned, equity still can be within the organizational change column. And anti-racism, though, will actually get you the equity that you're actually seeking. You actually can't do both. And so it's really important when we talk about sort of learnings is to begin to incorporate and understand some of those definitions that we talked about, but the overall value of having an anti-racist, equitable structure. So when we talk about anti-racism is ongoing. It's a process. It's ever evolving. Even at CommunityWise, who took us on 4.5 years ago, understood that it's going to be an ongoing process. So there is no end to it, which I know for some folks that might sound a little more exhausting, but it is an ongoing process, and which requires commitment to that work. And so consulting. So as I mentioned, anti-racism is is an important component to creating an equitable organization, because ultimately what equity means is understanding that there's been systems and barriers put up, and a lot of these systems that we refer to have disenfranchised people of color, racialized folks, and Indigenous. So part of being able to undo that system through an equitable lens is by consultation. And that really looks at interacting and hearing the voices and the experiences of those you're trying to benefit. Because when we talk about anti-racism structures, we know that it will actually benefit those who've been disenfranchised the most. And so that's really important when we talk about the importance of anti-racism work is about also being consulting. So, so just to summarize this, anti-racism is equitable, it's ongoing, and it requires consultation of Indigenous and racialized people. And then one of the things that I also want to really talk about here is how to make anti-R more effective. Is actually looking at white supremacy and a culture of whiteness. And so there's always, I've been hearing it the last few months, like, what can I do? How can I help? There's this sense of urgency that's happening, and I've been shouting it from the rooftops to some folks, is the value and importance of actually of if we're saying that equity is important, that means that there's been an inequitable system. And so this inequitable system has marginalized people of color and Indigenous folks, but also has been able to, white folks have been able to benefit from this system. And so when it comes to making it more effective, I actually think it's really important to, for white folks in the room to also begin to take accountability and understanding about how they've also been complicit or interacted with these forces. And so that's a very important piece. And I see Jax wanting to sort of chime in there.
I'm just reflecting on a note that Sister brought up, asking, does it need to go beyond consulting into intentional and transformative actions? Absolutely. Equity is action. Anti-racism is action, and dynamically responding to the needs of your community. Sorry. Consulting is only going to get you so far unless if you adopt the recommendations, because we, as Tyson's saying, that we exist from all levels of organizational structure, and even the funding models that we have in this nonprofit industrial complex. Philanthropy is set up so that we operate in a certain way to white supremacy and to this culture of whiteness. So without changing, without intentional transformative actions adopted, then we're just going to continue in the same flow of how things have been done in the status quo.
Yeah, a great example of this even just happened last night. As a Raptors fan, Fred Van Vliet was asked, "What are you going to do about the situation that happened in the U.S.?" He just point blank said, "Well, what are you going to do?" to the white reporter. And I think ultimately and there's a lot of, and when we talk about anti-racism, when we talk about that consultation piece, it's very important to center the voices of racialized and Indigenous folks, but it's also really important to look at how white supremacy and culture of whiteness has contributed to the frameworks that we were going to try to dismantle, and looking at anti-racism through its full holistic lens, not just from folks who are racialized, but also understanding that whiteness and the culture of whiteness. And we'll talk about what that definition is, because there's going to be a couple more points to this exercise that will help to consider that as a really important component when it comes to anti-racism work. So oftentimes we hear about, you know, we want to make space. We want to make space for people of color. We want to make this room bigger, so oftentimes, to allow for that to happen. And this metaphorical room, sometimes it actually requires white folks to actually step out of said room and create that space, rather than it's just more of. I really appreciated what Ruby Lopez said about a month ago at the last town hall, which was, she had said, we've been doing all this equitable work she mentioned a organization that she'd been working with for a while, and for about actually a decade, and yet she had said the people in leadership were still the same, still look the same. The diversity and the inclusion and the structures they were looking for didn't actually change the way the look of said organization. So I think it's really important that it's important to reflect back and look at an individual's participation. So we'll just go ahead, Jax.
Oh, just even adding to what you were saying, Tyson, about the reporter asking, what are you going to do about it? That reporter is probably feeling like he's committing to some type of allyship and speaking on behalf of that situation, but really that is a bit performative in that you see that he's not really doing anything. But to ask that question is one part, and then to act on it is actually being an accomplice.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that the value of that difference between being ally and accompliceship as well as we go forward.
And I hope you know that we don't really talk about diversity and inclusion because we want to see actual measurable, accountable change happen in organizational structures. And the only way to move with that is with equity as the goal, and which is the removal of systemic barriers, and with an anti-racist framework that actually can say racism is a thing and that needs structures and policies in place and a culture shift so that we can talk about it, talk about race. Okay. I was just going to read these real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So the definition of colonialism being a practice of domination, which involves the subjugation of one people to another, and white supremacy being a racist ideology that is based upon the belief that white people are superior in many ways to people of other races, and that therefore white people should be dominant over other races. That's by Layla Saad, and I recommend reading her book, White Supremacy and Me. It is a workbook that you could do individually or as an organization. And the culture of whiteness is defined as white people do not have to explain their culture, values, norms, because they are part of the dominant culture that sets the norm. And it is anti-Blackness.
I also just want to just mention what Cesara is asking. Well, can an anti-racist organization be sustainable in an environment that is deeply racist? I think sustainable, I'm not sure, but it can most definitely exist because we like, I exist here as a person who suffers from, you know, the racist oppression. Some of the folks on this call do. I think it's worth asking. The question is worth asking, and I mean, but I definitely think that it is that we all exist sort of in a deeply racist environment, and you're right. There needs to be social change that is an ongoing thing. But I definitely think that there's the value and importance of ensuring that doesn't mean that we stop, despite sort of the macro oppression that exists outside of it. And we'll actually talk about that, because I think that's when we refer to that community of care will really help to establish, despite all of that, how do we continue to care for each other in an anti-racist environment? or in a well, that too, but in a racist environment.
Anti-racism isn't going to cure racism. Like, I don't think as an individual I'm going to ever see racism end in my lifetime, but to know that I'm doing anti-racism work, to be able to talk about it, to be contributing to a culture that can speak to it, is part of the work that can contribute to that cultural shift, that social change that Cesar is reflecting on. I think I saw his hand go up.
So does that mean a video? Is that what that means?
Is that, yeah, you could turn on your video?
You want? Yeah, go ahead, Cesar. We'd like to see your face.
My point really, I agree with you that,
right.
You know, the work really needs to happen even in an environment that is deeply problematic and deeply racist. My point is that the work internally in organizations need to happen simultaneously with the work outside organization. Because sometimes what happens is people, and rightly so, I guess, that people are very focused on making the most perfect anti-racist organization, and then not doing anything beyond that, working on the social kind of change work across the community. So, and so that's my point. It's really, you cannot do the dichotomy between work within internal organizations and the work socially.
Yeah, keep it going. Yeah, totally, 100%. Thanks. So we will get into what is not anti-racism. So we, in the 2 slides before, we talked about what is anti-racism, and it is equity, it is ongoing, it is about consultation of those who you want to prop up, and in the anti-racism, it also takes a very important look at white supremacy and culture of whiteness that is contributing to racism as well. So what is it not? And I think, to Cesar's point, I think folks try to think about, yes, let's be the most anti-racist organization that ever exists. And oftentimes they actually fall into all of these traps. And so I think it's really important that we look at how these things attribute to an anti-racist organization, or how anti-racism work can really be stumbled by some of these things. So tokenism is this notion that, well, if we just hire said Black person, said Indigenous person into this role, that therefore then we will be, we are on our way to an anti-racist organization. We're going to talk a little bit more about tokenism with a framework that has been developed, and how it can actually cause a lot of isolation, further oppression, and also and from my own experience, the issue of having to play a certain role and not being able to come fully as you would like because of the tokenism. And it also, unfortunately, what ends up happening is, because I am jaqs is who they are, I am who I am. And so, but oftentimes if organizations are taking a very tokenistic approach to anti-racism, it ends up being that I become the sole bearer of all Black men in my organization and interactions, when really that's not the case. So that's usually is how tokenism operates. And so metrics of success. So metrics of success really is looking at when we begin reevaluating when we begin to reevaluate how we want to go about anti-racism, we need to actually change how we believe and understand success. And so we're going to talk a little bit about governance as a key barrier, our current structure of governance as a key barrier to how we understand what defines success. And so, yes, static change. I just want to reach to my notes here quickly here, sorry. as I assumed, I already mentioned it, but it really is this idea that in order for change to happen, we also need to maybe begin to create room for folks to feel like they're included. I mentioned here the Ruby Lopez comment about the change, and that's sort of that static change. Nothing has actually changed despite the efforts of anti-racism. And so I urge you, if you're already on the work of doing anti-racism, and it's been a couple of years, although it's ongoing, things should have changed in the outcomes that you're actually looking for. There should be some level of it, and if it's not, I think it's really, are we operating in an anti-racist framework, and then ultimately, then are we being equitable? So this just comes back to the only diversity and inclusion, and not really thinking about equity as a really important part to this. Jax, I don't know if you did. Sorry, did you have something you want to add, or?
It goes back to even the definition of BIPOC, how
Thank you.
the term is Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or racialized folks. And the reason why it's in that order is because the way to truly have an anti-racist framework, or to have an anti-racist space is an equitable, is where you actually have, you center the voices and leadership of Black and Indigenous needs in your organization. And Pam Zhang pointed out this amazing account, Janaya, the Future Khan, on Instagram. She did a Sunday sermon Instagram story on June 14th, if you can look it up. But she talks about how penguins in the Antarctic organize themselves by the needs of heat, by a resource that keeps them alive. And if you can picture a circle of penguins, the ones that are the warmest will just move to the outside. And those that are coldest will move to the center. And in our current society, the coldest, those with the least resources, those with the greatest amount of systemic barriers are Black and Indigenous people. And if we were to do our community organizing, structure our organizations with Black and Indigenous people in the middle, those, and the folks who are most impacted by structural systemic oppression, they know exactly what they need. And then we, on the outside, can support them if we have more resources, and then we just move, and then as the resources build out, then they move out. But the penguins move out. But we need to be more willing to give up space and move those who know what they need into the center, to center our organizational structures so that we have those voices speaking to their needs directly and creating the structures or programs that they need, as opposed to just having them in tokenistic positions, in short-term contract positions, only fulfilling that diversity role. Well, we'll get a little further on in that.
I think in the last term of what it's not is white saviorism. And that, I think when you mentioned the penguin, I think oftentimes what happens, and I've been in different organizations where, you know, they might be a white serving organization. And by that, I mean, a lot of nonprofits have a certain select demographic that they end up serving. And there might be, you know, different groups who are also in that same space. And sometimes the question is, oh, well, we'll just create that program, or we'll just do, or we'll put more money to this, and that actually ends up taking away from the groups who are actually in their communities. And so I think sometimes it's also about maybe it's about partnership, maybe it's about giving that space that people talk about, that groups talk about. But I think it's really important that we also back to that consultation piece. It's about hearing and listening what is the needs of those groups so that everyone can actually be warm, taking that penguin scenario. And so, yeah, anyway, that's just a few things to kind of keep in mind. And these are all terms and ideas that you can begin to consider whether you're already on this work of anti-racism and otherwise. And I think there will be, if really given the correct space, the people of color and Indigenous folks in the room will tell you if these are kind of the benchmark. So I do urge you to listen to those voices if ever comes up where, oh, I'm not really sure if you're meeting what anti-racism looks like. And like I say, it's ongoing and it's uncomfortable as well. So we will move on to sort of a few pieces of the onion that jaqs mentioned above. And so we'll go through that. Anti-racism in marketing. Yeah, it is not these things. And I think I've been part of organizations that have also fallen into this trap as well. So we saw back in June about the Black Square, and I call it just that, the Black Square. And it really, and what that actually, and for those of you who may not know, there was a thing on Instagram that asked folks to urge folks to indicate on their feeds of a Black Square. And so many organizations across even Calgary, from businesses to nonprofits to influencers, brought that up to people's attention. But what you start to see is that there's no follow-up about what that work is. And that's sort of that difference between that's this shallow form of allyship. We also see here putting a solidarity statement. And those I think are good, but then it's really important to follow up with action of what you plan to do in the moment. I'm sure I'm part of some stock photo somewhere also as well, but then there's this idea of stock photos being something as a form of diversity. And I think it's really important is those are fine in of themselves, but those people do exist, whatever that might look like. So you might have, and being able to actually tell those stories. And marketing, I think, requires a level, it takes more time. Anti-racism does take more time because there's not a structures in place to actually uphold this work. And so it does take time. So it does take time to actually tell the story of what looks like a stock photo of that Black or Indigenous person doing the work that you do, are in the picture, are, and doesn't mean to be all the time, but it's really important. I would even say, go as far as to say that I think what's happens here in these town halls are only effective if folks then take that on forward. And what that looks like, I think it is about creating accountability. And I think it's really important that we say, yeah, we're doing town halls. Look at what we're showing, but then also being able to ensure that there is action, and that action is only as accountable as folks can do. So anyway, that's what when it comes to marketing as part of the onion, of reframing how some of our organizations can perpetuate racism. So these are just some very ways that does exist.
And another, to add to stock photos, often it can just be a branding representational of an idea of what diversity means, when all the leadership and the entire staff mostly is comprised of white people, where there are no racialized people on staff or paid staff, and only the racialized people are only in volunteer or contract positions.
Okay, so what
And
is...
also, just one more thing though. Even though like there was a lot of backlash about putting up the black square, and then a lot of people started saying that they're afraid of saying anything at all. That's what anti-racism is. You try something, and you learn in the process.
Yeah.
And even if you get messaging about, oh, you did this wrong, that's still part of learning. And I think Nicole Brewer, she's an anti-racist facilitator from New York, talks about how you need to be able to speak in draft and not be afraid of doing something wrong, because it's the expert model that white supremacy pushes out there to make us feel like we're incompetent, like we can't do anything. But you don't have to be an expert to do it. You just need to try, and that's how your organization will develop that emergent strategy.
Yeah, and I think and the consultation piece is so important, right? Because you'll never know if you're not consulting. And same with the definitions. You try it out, you practice it, and understand it. And so that's anyway.
Yeah, when something happens, I always ask, like, who am I accountable to? Who are the impacted communities I can check in with to find out like what, and pay them to find out what is the next step that our organization can take.
And I guess I already spoke to this actually. So I mentioned stories, and I mentioned what actions you actually take. So if there's anything more to that, jaqs, we could add, but otherwise we could probably move forward.
So anti-racism in governance is not top-down, and it is, we're going to save this in the next slide, but it is decentering power. There are ways of creating consensus-based structures that don't replicate this top-down hierarchy where only one person drives the ship. In emergent strategy, Adrienne Marie Brown reflects on how birds, like in that V shape, take turns in leading, so that the lead bird is breaking like the aerodynamic force all the time, and they get tired, so they switch. And that's trusting your team, trusting the people you work with, knowing that they're capable of taking the lead of making decisions. But that also takes relationship building. And anti-racism in governments is not static and unable to adapt to new situations. So it is often developing policies or developing processes as you go. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Tyson.
I would just like to add quickly that I think when I've gone to do facilitations around anti-racism with certain groups, one of the prerequisites is leadership. There is the people who are able to make those decisions there to listen and understand what the people their staff are saying about how they want to change. I think it's really important. So when we talk about that top-down approach, it's very much, oh, well, they just need to learn. And that's a little bit different from governance, but I think it plays a part in how decisions and how we talk about equity. I mean, equity then is everyone's in the room. I mean, more or less, right? And so that's very important.
And it's also important to credit and acknowledge the labor that is due. I think we are not talking about intersectionality today, but we've talked about it many times, like in previous, there's a whole, you can just look up, but if I never talk about intersectionality without crediting Kimberly Crenshaw from LA. She was a UCLA scholar, lawyer, who shifted the entire culture around the intersection of race, class, and gender. And if you, just to credit a Black scholar woman in developing that term and that new lens, is to speak to how much we need to learn about what she created. It's not just a term to tack on to a mission statement or a document. There's a great amount of responsibility that comes with being able to say that your organization has an intersectional lens in hiring, in governance, in the way that processes are play out. So it's really important to understand and credit those who develop certain terms and ideologies. Okay, we are at 4:30.
That's all right. Well, I guess we'll keep rolling for a little bit more.
Okay.
Absolutely, Jackson, Tyson, please do. I just wanted to let people know that we were recording the event, but what you're offering here is awesome. Thanks.
Thank you. Also, if you, just to go back to the question that you were asking, Patty, about the description on equity, I think there's some terms that I shared previously in one of the chat and choose. If that can be made accessible to people, it would be an addition to this recording as well. So anti-racism in governments. It is decentralized power, creating decision-making that involved inclusion, consensus, and transparency. And yes, equity and anti-racism will require us to reconsider the method in which we make decisions. It should be the guiding, those should be the guiding lenses that we use. And goals. Anything you want to add there? You want to add anything there, Tyson?
No.
Okay. And anti-racism in hiring practices is not a singular Black, Indigenous, or racialized person in programming or contract positions, or only hiring BIPOC in a diversity officer role and nowhere else. There are often organizations that have diversity roles in whether it's like a diversity officer, and that one individual has to field every question that has anything to do with race, anything that has to do with anything that is like, even, I'll just give an example, like the info session for the grant. I don't know if for the grant, the capacity building grant offered by the city, the one racialized woman was offered all the harder questions, or the questions that had anything to do with community. And I think that is a lot of extra labor for an individual who's paid the same, if not less, than everybody else. And anti-racism in hiring practices is training staff in cultural humility, which I will talk about in a minute, and valuing lived experience as much as, if not more than, institutional credentials. Lived experience speaks volumes when you're talking about anti-racism, when you're talking about equity, because I think privilege can offer certain views that may not offer an entire scope. And it's listing, and in anti-racism hiring practices is listing a diversity clause with a commitment to anti-racism on job postings. And that just offers of course, that's all, I recommend not putting a diversity clause on your job postings until you've done most of the work that can develop a culture where a BIPOC person can feel welcome in that culture and in your workspace. Otherwise, you may be harming someone, because even though inclusion is about including people of diverse backgrounds into a space that can often be monolithic, what are you inviting them into is the question. Is that a safe space for them? Do they have processes in place where they can actually report any situation of harassment or oppressive language or behavior? And so what I was just reflecting to with cultural humility, it is the ability to maintain an interpersonal stance that is other-oriented or open to the other in relation to aspects of cultural identity that are most important to the person. Cultural humility is different from other culturally based training ideals because it focuses on self-humility rather than achieving a state of knowledge or awareness. This is a term that was coined by Melanie Turbalon and Jan Murray Garcia in 1998. They are healthcare professionals from the Bay Area in California, and determined that organizations and were not offering the right amount of cultural understanding for offering the cultural specific healthcare or bedside manner to people, to individuals. And this is, I guess, again, playing against the idea of the expert model, where you can do a 3-hour seminar on cultural competency and get a certificate and put that on your LinkedIn and be hired for jobs with diverse populations and sell the idea that you can navigate successfully. But it is just like how I'll never know Tyson fully and completely. It's a relationship building process where I'll get to know him every time I interact with him. It's any different group, I will only be able to get to know them better by as much time as I commit to learning more. So these are the cultural humility principles: lifelong commitment to learning and critical self-reflection. 2, desire to fix power imbalances within provider-client dynamic or leadership and stakeholder dynamics. 3, institutional accountability and mutual respectful partnership based on trust. So these are all at the intersections of beliefs, attitudes, skills, and knowledge, moving away from the idea, again, that you can be competent in someone's culture just by reading a book or doing even a 6-month course. I guess I want to read this from Pam. Is that okay? I'd like to share that I feel the work of anti-racism for white folks in arts communities is to disrupt white supremacy culture in their predominantly white organizations. White folks need to find courage and build their personal capacity to see and acknowledge and be accountable to the ways white supremacy transpires in their behaviors and ways of working through the myriad of relationships that they, staff, community, partners, funders, etc., take the necessary risks to break white solidarity, to acknowledge harm done, create accountability mechanisms if they do not already exist, to be attuned to the subtle and overt behaviors that are harmful to all, not just racialized, but all equity-seeking peoples. That's great. Okay, I think this was also in Ruby and Bree's presentation last month. This is from Coco out of Montreal, the problem of color in the workplace. And really, this diagram is to represent how to prevent a situation that tokenizes and isolates a person and harms a person of color. I'll just take you through it really quickly. Like a marginalized person, an equity-seeking person, woman of color enters the organization, and white leadership sees it as like a honeymoon period where the woman of color feels welcomed, needed, and happy. And this is a tokenized hire where there is no preparation for staff, for leadership, or an organization to understand what it actually means, what type of responsibilities come in with hiring a person outside of a dominant culture, outside of the culture of whiteness. And then the reality sets in where the woman of color points out issues within the organization, and she tries to work within the organization's structure and policies, and she pushes for accountability. And this causes repetitive injury and microaggressions. And then the response is the organization desires, I think that is what it says, denies, ignores, and blames. The responsibility of fixing the problem is placed on the woman of color, and people of color are pitted against each other. And then finally, there's retaliation, where the organization decides that the woman of color is the problem and targets her. The organization labels the conflict as a communication issue or claims that she is not qualified or a good fit. And then the woman of color exits the organization. Yeah. So Adrienne Rebrown from Emergent Strategy says that we have to create futures in which everyone doesn't have to be the same kind of person. That's allowing for autonomous, individual identities to share spaces, and that where we trust each other with our different perspectives. And going back to what Tyson was saying, that where we can show up and fully be ourselves and not have to code our identities when according to what spaces we attend or present.
I want to add as well that I think what's really important is this notion that, oh, well, we do have diverse hires, we do have even diverse leadership, and I challenge that because I think oftentimes, and I've fallen into this trap as well, where you have to actually still behave similar to what Pam is referring to here within sort of the context of a white culture. And I don't mean white people, I mean a culture of whiteness that requires and asks of you to be governed in a top-down approach, to be okay with being the only one there. The metrics of success are very much already in place, and that we're not willing to adapt. That to me is very much, so you have to still play sort of the zero-sum game, so to speak. And despite what folks what your organization might tell you about how you need to, about how you're doing very well, it does still limit you in that. And so we see this onion here, and there's various different components. I also believe that leadership should be one of the layers. And so there is, and I think when we talk about anti-racism, these are the things that create racist organizations, and anti-R really helps to unpack all of that, but it takes time. So that external communications is something that's maybe an easy win, and maybe something that you're already thinking of. But then to kind of continue to peel back all the different layers, and it's ongoing, and it can really transform your organization. And this, and the reason for this session was to just sort of help to begin to, especially for organizations who understand they want to be equitable, to consider what equity looks like, and then also then being able to layer that on to anti-racism. So we do want to go into the next part here, which is just sort of, community of care. So if you are an organization that is already doing this process of anti-racism, what does that look like to then still create a community that is caring for one another, that is compassionate, and is ultimately serving those within it well. So we'll just go to the next section here. So I do want to talk about Pink Flamingo. We did get permission from Allison to talk about this, but really we want to sort of use that as a case study, I guess, in terms of how community cares is just as important as the anti-racism efforts that are happening. So community care is the approach or an organization needs to have while developing anti-racist structures. And I also just want to implore that community care doesn't mean it has to be organizations. This could be within your community, and how to relate to one another. So this idea acknowledges past harm, I think is important, because in the situation of Pink Flamingo, we have a BIPOC organization putting up an anti-racist mural, essentially, right? And what we know is a community of care will be able to despite the harm that we know we're actually going to expose people to, because this is a reality, regardless of sort of and this is back to Cesar's point. The environment, the racist environment, exists regardless of how anti-racist an organization can become. And in order to change the social norms, we do have to go outside of that. We do have to begin to change that. So a community of care acknowledges that there's going to be retribution, that there's going to be potential harm that is going to be done. So I think that's step one of creating a community of care as it relates to anti-racism, is you're aware that racism does exist. Therefore, the work you're going to do will be will have backlash, just like we saw here in Calgary. The next part here is humility. So community of care requires folks to have a sense of humility. So there's one component, which is that you acknowledge the fact that there's going to be harm, but then when it comes to how can we help, how can we take care of you, what do you need from us, it's also acknowledging the fact that you're humble enough, as whether it's an organization or as an individual, to understand how you also play into these hurtful dynamics. Without that, it doesn't, and what you're responsible for. Without that, it really doesn't, it's really hard to then change the system that you are aware exists. And so most organizations tend to play this as we want to show solidarity, but we aren't also able to acknowledge how we also screw up and play a part in this. So that's another part of that community care. So it's we're going to put you out there, and we also know that it's dynamic, but it is a real important. And then here, this influence. The influence is, what can you do? So it is looking at what is within your area of influence and sphere of change that you can then begin to enact. So these are kind of layered in that regard, but it's acknowledging the harm that will exist, that will happen, acknowledging how you contribute to said harm, and then also then being able to go, what can I do to change it? And so a community of care looks at that as a way to approach the kind of culture that we're actually looking for, because we can't necessarily change, because white supremacy is large and it's very much impactful, and so we need to be able to create the kind of culture we want to see, and that's by really holding each other accountable as well in this community of care as a theme. The outcome of community care is a space where those who are feeling impacted by racism find refuge and safety. And because it's not a guarantee that racism will never happen, because that's not the outcome. The goal is to be able to be in a space where you can be heard and find healing. And just to kind of reflect back on the pink flamingo situation, is that it is that when we talk about, how can we support, how can we find influence, create influence, it's looking at that situation going, how is, as an organization in the sphere of public art, contribute to a community of care? They're a part of our community, so what does that look like? So what does showing up look like? I think it really does begin with this idea of gratitude, and not to be, it's not just being positive. It's actually just about coming up with, it's about being able to display sort of the gratitude and humility required. I think it's the difference between self-care and community care. Self-care, we say, yeah, take some time to separate yourself from a situation, whatever that might be. Sometimes, and it's still very consumeristic, a very consumerist approach to it. And community care actually is the attitude of what can we do to support your self-care, essentially, is I think a way to look at it. Calling in versus calling out. So we see problematic behavior happen, and oftentimes we say, let's call it out. Let's just, and this can happen internally and externally from an organization. But what does it look like to call people in? And we referenced that earlier. Jack was saying it isn't about, we're all on this journey together. And so it is about being able to embrace folks when they make mistakes. And in that care that I'm speaking of, and ensuring that there's opportunity to actually repair the harm versus asking them to leave said group if that's what they don't wish to do. They're willing to make the attempts to repair that harm. And this comes back to canceling or quitting is not accountability and doesn't produce a community of care. So cancel culture, quitting, we're not going to do another mural. We're just going to stop. We're just going to. That doesn't produce the kind of community of care required. But there's a caveat to this, which is if the BIPOC person wants to quit because it is hard, because it is challenging, it is disruptive, then let it be so. And then reframing, what can I do to, here's what I can do if that's what you need. I think oftentimes we will send a message off and saying, yeah, what can I do to help? And that sometimes takes more onus on the person who's being impacted to then come up with ideas of how they might be able to help you. It's not always so clear in the moment. And so the idea of here's what I can do, or here's what I can offer, I think is so much more beneficial, and it's much more straightforward. Because sometimes what they need is not what you can actually provide anyway. So it's very important to be able to know that. Jax, you mentioned a lot about relationships, and I think that's super important, is actually spending time with one another. Okay, that cultural humility piece is so important, is getting to understand and know what people not only need, but how to actually serve them in a way that they like. And then also trust. I think trust is always broken when harm is done. And so whether it's big or small, is as knowing that there needs to be a process, but also knowing that that might take time, and maybe it never will be fully repaired. But taking the pink flamingo as a demonstration is really important about that. So we do have a couple more. Yeah, go ahead to the next one there. I think that's you, Jax.
Yeah, so organization as an active bystander is offering support.
I do want to add, sorry, to this, is I think we often think of that bystander effect, similar to what Sherry mentioned, as an individual. And I think organizations can also contribute to this as a whole, contribute to this dynamic as well, for folks who are kind of wondering where our ideas care is coming from.
So when you hear something, say something. Going back to what Tyson was saying, asking, unless if there's an arrangement where the impacted person wants to have first say on what happens next, then that is when you give the responsibility to them to guide the process. But for example, like organizations that are witnessing harm in the community, you can say something on, like, as an organization, like as a witness, not just simply watch something happen, but actually contribute to a narrative that says, no, I'm not going to tolerate racism in my community. No, I'm not going to tolerate racism in my arts community, and say that you support a person who is in harm's way. ask, listen, and offer what you have. Again, that's saying what Tyson was saying around offering what you can give in a space as opposed to waiting. And then as opposed to lecturing or offering unsolicited advice, and offer what you have without conditions. It's not a time to give advice. It's just a time to support someone. Then offer that solidarity with action. Is there a comment? I can't see it because I...
No, there's not.
Okay. And please do not put extra labor on BIPOC folks. This is part of asking the ask of when someone if you can help them. It's time to be brave and speak up. Just what Pam was saying around going against the grain of the code of silence, and actually speaking up towards and against racism. And then this is extra labor on BIPOC folks, is seeking validation for awareness, like pointing out certain things to your BIPOC friends yes, we do notice these things, and it doesn't really help the process, unless if you're going to do something about it. We don't need to see it. So that is coming to an end here, where we just want to remind you that equity is the removal of systemic barriers, and being an accomplice takes action. Allyship definitely can get you more likes and gain social capital, but anti-racist accomplices, you might lose friends. You might lose, you might not be able to talk to some family members about something, but it is action that takes you to the level of being an accomplice. Like, what are you? So I guess we want to ask this question. What are your commitments starting today that you'd like to share of anti-racist commitments? You put them in the chat, and feel free to share them, or put your hand up and you can turn your mic on. Thanks, everybody.
Hi. Yeah, thank you everyone for following along. I do appreciate everyone's attention for this afternoon. I wanted to add that jaqs to point about the bystander is I think it might change the way that your funding models. It might change who becomes on your board. It might change your audience. It might change the way that you do the work, and so and all in the sake of equity, actually, because it does mean that you will be better for it as an organization, and the public that you serve will be better for it. So, but I am interested to know if there's any folks who want to be brave or have thought about some commitments that they want to be able to do. And we'll probably take maybe 5-10 minutes for that, as it is 5 o'clock. And if there isn't any, then that's also what is happening. So.
Hi, Tyson and jaqs. It's Patty here. Thank you both very much. I think a lot of what you've shared with all of us was really great. And for those of you who haven't had an opportunity to check out some of the AROC resources and tools on their website, you just got a really great grounding that some people are waiting until November or December to receive. So you've had the benefit of some really wonderful expertise and experience and wisdom this afternoon. And so for that, I'm very thankful to the two of you for taking this time. We do have a few minutes, and I would invite you and really encourage you to respond to the question that jaqs and Tyson have posed about what are the things that you think you can do or that you will do, having learned what you know. I love that term, cultural humility. I heard it for the first time a week or so ago. I've been thinking a lot about that. And speaking as me, when you put the slide up about the problem woman of color, I know what it is to live that. And so when you live in that slide, and then the thought of having more humility, when I see others around me who don't have some of the options that I live with, is really hard. And so for those of you who do live in a dominant culture, I'd invite you to consider what it is to show humility, to be self-aware. That would be one observation. It's not an action I'm going to do, but I'd certainly invite you to consider that. I'd open this up to any members of the CADA team as well. We've had the great benefit of working with people from AROC in the past. That onion diagram is very resonant to me. I'm scanning. Give it another minute or so, and if we're all feeling okay, or maybe just want to be sitting with this, I'm checking the questions. Doc, nope.
I think actually something that I've learned, honestly, and it's been reiterated to me in not only from this session, but in future sessions, I believe, honestly, is to be able to actually, is to look at I've been on the other end of certain sessions where it is myself or other people of color talking about their experiences, talking about their impact, the impact of structures that are in place that are impacting them, whether that's through a service model, whether that's through project management, whether the barriers that are faced, and it often continues to ask of people of color to do the labor to convince those in power what needs to change, and that comes back to that consultation piece. And so for me, I think it's also really important to, as I move forward, to begin to expose and explore how the culture of whiteness, and specifically from white folks in the room, to begin to look at how they understand their impact, how they are impacting a certain structure, or what they do plan to change moving forward. I think that's ultimately where some of the conversation needs to actually lend itself. So that's something that I'm going to commit to moving forward, is ensuring that space, that accountability is there within those conversations as well. And here today, I think given such a small time and different dynamic than what I'm used to, I think it's really important. So hopefully for those who are listening can also take that away as well. But I think I will say, I think thanks, Jane, for your comment.
Okay, well, I think, yeah. Oh, thank you, Jane. That's awesome. So we are at just after 5 o'clock. So if I might, I think what we'll do is wrap up our proceedings for today. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to talk about where we are at next steps. And if you want to put something in the chat, please know we will include it in the transcript, unless you mark it private, in which case we won't. So that, again, you can come back to this proceeding as a resource for you in the future. A lot of those definitions that you had up were really great, and I know I will be certainly going back to those. So again, many thanks, jaqs and Tyson. Thank you so much. Thanks to the CADA team again for everything you've done here. As I said earlier, this is the last of our summer anti-racism town hall sessions. We've had 5 of them, which are incredible. We will keep those up on our website for people to refer back to, because I think there's, even today, lots of information to rest with. that you may want to have some kind of a response to later on. And in light of that, I wanted to let you know that we will be scheduling another town hall, an anti-racism town hall, on September 30th. It's a Wednesday from 3 to 5. And our plan for that session is to do a bit of a deeper dive and a reflection on the 5 town halls that we've hosted. It's an opportunity, if you watch any of the recordings and you want to come back and ask a question or raise something, we'll create space for that on September 30th. There were also, you'll remember if you joined us for the very first town hall, we started this as a way for the community to ask Calgary Arts Development questions about where we were at in our own work around anti-racism and around what we call equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. And I haven't looked at that first town hall yet, but I will. And but I feel really different, you know, like taking part in these town halls is not something you can unlearn. You can't not acknowledge what has happened in the 5 town halls, or at least I can't. And so it's continued to help me understand and build how I think about our work here at Calgary Arts Development. So the 30th will be a time where we do that deeper dive, and you'll all receive a notification of that meeting by virtue of having registered. The registration link will be, oh, it's actually already up. And I'm copying it and I'm pasting it into the chat right now. So if you want to register right now, you're welcome to, but again, we'll be sending it out to everybody. So check our website, we'll have it in our newsletter. If there are thoughts or questions that you have from today's session, please feel free to send it to any one of us and we'll do our best to try and direct it to Tyson or jaqs. Tyson, you have a question or a comment?
No, I do actually, sorry. Pam also would like to just bring up a comment as well, if that's.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah, sorry, sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. September 30th, I think it's great, but Pam, if you want to go ahead. I noticed that your hand was up, and so.
Thanks for flagging that. I kind of hesitated on sharing, but I guess reflecting in the brief moment that Patty was speaking, I just thought maybe this is a learning opportunity. Just like as a racialized person who's been attending these town halls and really deeply cares about this work, and am looking to, I may get a little bit emotional today, it's one of those days, but looking to community and to have hope that my white peers and colleagues and community, I think a lot of folks are tuning in, and I just still have to acknowledge, and I'm not going to point anything, but I have to acknowledge that as a racialized person, to not see my peers, and I also know that everyone has their own capacity amidst everything and is trying to learn, but it's disappointing to not see folks being able to make a public expression of their commitment, what's small or large, whatever it be. It's just, I think it's just important to share that, because I've been asking, like, what is it? And so my commitment is to continue trusting that people are doing the work behind the scenes and that there's genuine care. But I have, it feels like being a little bit in the dark. I don't know how to go further with that. It's still not processed, but I had a feeling of disappointment, and I just want to acknowledge that, so that, because I think this might be experienced by other folks too, who are really committed to being here and who are grappling with something that they can't escape from. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pam.
Thanks for sharing that, Pam, as well. If I just can add to that, if this is the first time for many of you to ever do anti-racist discussions, talk about white supremacy in the context where it's not just about the KKK or about neo-Nazis, and understand that we live in a white supremacist culture, then it might be difficult to commit to something in this moment. I'm not making excuses, but I do hope that that work between these anti-racism town halls, between the chat and choose, between trainings that you do, builds that courage to say something and to do something within your community, because it's more than just showing up at these events that will shift culture and that make it easier. This is not easy work at all, for BIPOC people, for white people, but it is harder for us to be able to move and shift anything if we can't commit to it in between public facing events.
Can I add something?
Absolutely. I'm not sure who that is.
Sorry.
Jacqueline? Oh, okay. Hi, Jacqueline.
Hi. I just wanted to add to that I think for myself, I'm committed to showing it. So I hope for the people around me that I'm demonstrating the things that I'm saying, that it's not just words, because for me personally, words mean very little, because it's more in the action that takes place. And for me personally, a friend of mine started a group called Let's Talk About Racism, where we meet every 2 weeks to kind of discuss and have these things. And so it's been a very interesting community building exercise with different people that I've been able to have these conversations more regularly with a variety of different people that she is associated with. And I just really appreciate these discussions. I think that they're really important. And I just, to Pam's point, that the disappointment spans us all, I think, as we discuss these things and see them. It's hard to sometimes, for me personally, to accept where people are in their journey, to not have people in my life see where things, how things that I see very clearly and that are demonstrated, and how they don't see them at all. And so it is something that I'm learning of everyone's where they're at, and I have to learn sometimes to meet them where they're at in order to continue conversations around anti-racism. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline, for sharing that. Do we see anybody else? I'm just looking for hands, and I'm often not very good at noticing those things. One thing as well that I'd like to mention, for those of you in the performing arts community, you may already be aware, but if not, there is an initiative currently being led by a group of BIPOC artists called 3550. And it is a call to action for white-led organizations to commit to looking at your hiring structures and your representation within your organizations to meet 35% of your staff and board being of a visible minority, and a minimum of 50% being women. And this group of artists has undertaken some Herculean efforts to have a number of signatories, many of you who I know are on this call. Calgary Arts Development has received this letter, and we are currently in process of looking at it within our own organization. The first thing it prompted us to do was our own audit of our organization with regard to how people choose to self-identify. We didn't want to make assumptions about whether or not you considered yourself a visible minority, as an example, or a BIPOC person, or any other kind of identities. And so we wanted to know where we stood, and as we have this conversation through our organizations, our intention certainly will be to support this initiative. As many of you know, with boards of directors and various leaderships, it's a process for us to work through, but I did want to just let everybody know about that initiative. And if you'd like to learn more, you can certainly reach out to Calgary Arts Development and we can pass that information along. Pam, I don't know if you're comfortable, but Pam is one of those organizers, and we can perhaps connect any of you to any of the organizers who have been engaged in this effort. Okay, checking the chats, don't see anything there. I will end this call and again extend my thanks to all of you. I really appreciate you being with us today and through any of the sessions you've been a part of. The recording will go up in a couple of weeks along with the transcript. Thanks again. Have a great rest of your Wednesday, and we'll speak with you soon on September 30th, if not before. Bye. Thank you.